Hello, and thank you for joining us today for another installment of Concord Stories from Special Collections. My name is Anke Voss, and I'm the curator of the William Monroe Special Collections here at the Concord Free Public Library. We're honored to have as our guest today, Bill Bailey, who will talk to us about his efforts to document the voices of new immigrants in Concord. Bill is the former history department head at Concord Academy, where he taught and inspired students for 35 years, from 1967 through 2002. He's a graduate of Columbia College and has a master's degree in history from Columbia University. Bill returned to Concord in late March of last year, after living in New York City for nearly 2 decades. In New York, he taught at the Little Red Schoolhouse in Elizabeth Urban High School, a progressive independent school in Lower Manhattan. He was also an active member of the Rutgers Presbyterian Church, a church with a strong commitment to peace and social justice advocacy. At the church, Bill taught English to Syrian refugees, many of whom have remained close friends. Welcome, Bill. We're so pleased that you could join us here today.
And I'm happy to be here.
Bill, you served a total of 3 terms, 9 years to be exact, on the Concord Historical Commission. In your first term, from 1980 to 83, you served with Renee Gerlich. Renee, as many viewers may recall, coordinated the Concord History Project starting in 1976 on behalf of the Concord Historical Commission. Those oral histories in recordings and transcripts are held by special collections. A significant portion are available on our website, and an additional progress is being made to convert the rest by the end of the year, hopefully. While serving on the commission in 1982, Bill, you received a grant as part of a proposal made by the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do a study of ethnic groups in Concord. The immigrants you interviewed from 82 to 87 came from Ireland, Canada, Norway, Italy, Russia, among others. I'm excited to share that you donated these recordings and transcripts to special collections, and we hope to make them available online later this year. Thank you so much.
I'm very pleased. Thank you.
So can you give us a little background on what inspired you to conduct these oral histories and to write about the new immigrant experience in Concord?
What happened was that I was a member of the Concord Carlisle Adult Education Committee. And that was back around 1975, 76. I'm not exactly sure of the date. But what happened was that there was an incident on the high school grounds in which there was a fight between Concord boys and what we would call Metco boys, that are students who came from Boston. All of the towns, many of them anyway, in suburban Boston, offered places for these students to come and study. And somehow there was a conflict and a big fight. Concord was appalled that this would, in our town, which is noted for, one of the books is called Climate for Freedom. So the question was, really, is this the right climate? And so 3 wonderful women on that committee, Anna Alden, Ruth Drinker, and Ruth Salinger, said, we need to look at the past and see what the town, how the town went about welcoming or not welcoming immigrants. And they looked at me and they said, Bill Bailey, will you do this? And I was launched. And that was the beginning of my interest in the population in Concord that was not from the UK. But as you would expect, and most people think even today that it is, and it's not. So I started doing taped interviews with people, most of whom were second generation. There were a small number that were first generation who had emigrated themselves. but most of them were second and maybe even some were third generation. Irish, the largest single group were Irish, and a Norwegian community, and a Sicilian community. And then I also interviewed 3 or 4 Jewish families, one of whom had been a tailor in Concord and had moved to Florida. And I had a phone interview with him and his daughter. And he was absolutely marvelous.
Great, thank you so much. Can you tell me, as part of this project and the initiative kind of getting started, in what way was the Concord Carlisle Human Rights Council involved in initiating or supporting this project?
To be honest with you, I am not aware that they had a role in the very beginning. It was simply the Adult Education Committee that I was responding to. But then I think the Human Rights Council took it the next step.
Right.
And sponsored a series of lectures that were given at Concord Academy in the famous Elizabeth Hall Chapel. And what happened is that the beginning lecture was given by a woman whose name, as you know, I can't remember, who talked about the first peoples who were here, Native Americans. A very good way to start, because what we were looking at is, what is a Concordian? And here we were with this, and then I gave a lecture on the Irish. Bob Gross gave a lecture on the his responses to having studied the Minutemen in his wonderful book, and what he learned about the town of Concord in the process. I think Renee may have ended the series. I can't. I'm sorry. My memory is not so good about this.
Ended the series of interviewing immigrants or interviewing in general?
Interviewing for me anyway, it was interviewing simply immigrants and their descendants.
Right.
In a small number of cases, I interviewed some of the old, for lack of a better word, Yankee people who were so much a part of the history, and whose families sometimes went back 2, 3, and even 4 generations of living. Some were descendants of the Concord Minutemen,
right?
At least in one case.
Yes, we have several hundred oral histories, some of which, again, have been digitized, are available on our website. Your collection of interviews with new immigrants is close to 70. So it's a really, really rich collection. And it's a lot of work that you did in conducting those oral histories. And we're grateful that those records exist. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. One of the joys of interviewing these people was the prevailing element of modesty on their part. Over and over, as I started to introduce myself and they introduced themselves to me, they would say, I really don't think I have much to say. And that was never true, ever.
Of course not.
But that's what they conveyed. So they were easy for me to interview. I never had an experience in which there was any kind of hostility, not only aimed at me, but aimed at the town, Concord. For the most part, they were very proud to be Concordians. I approached it without knowing whether that would be the case. I didn't have any preconceived opinions when I started.
That was actually one of my questions about how you actually went about selecting your subjects.
What would happen is that in some cases, Renee would tell me about people that she had interviewed. And then if they were of immigrant stock, I would contact them. And looking at their lifetimes in a somewhat different way from Renee, in the sense that I wanted to know to what degree their heritage influenced them in their livelihoods, in terms of their interaction with people of the same group and their interaction with people who were very different from themselves.
I mean, you've spoken to me about the various interviews and all these wonderful and rich conversations that you had with your subjects. Are there any stories that you recall that are particularly compelling to you?
Yes. Once I interviewed the Shimoni family, who were from Sicily, and I interviewed, and again, we'll have to find out her first name, maybe Flora Shimoni. And they ran the Shimoni farm on Bedford Road. And she said that what happened, she was a little girl. She came and she said, so when I got here and we got off the bus, I got down on my hands and knees and touched the dirt, touched the ground, because I was told that the streets in America were paved with gold. And in fact, it was just dirt. So that sort of thing I would never have anticipated, that were so enriching. And then another one was Chris Anderson, who was one of the few who was first generation. He was born in Leuten in Norway, where by far the largest percentage of Norwegians in this town all came from Leuten, a relatively small town in Norway. And he described coming, and he gave me a picture of the town, which looks almost desolate. And in those days, Norway was, when he came, a poor country. It was not what it is today, one of the wealthiest. And I recall him telling me that his mother came with him and his family, and his mother missed Norway so much. She could not assimilate. There were some remarkable stories and novels written about the Midwest by Hamlin Garland and others like him. A Norwegian, whose name also escapes me. Some just simply could not adapt. So she chose to go back to Norway at the time of the Nazi invasion of Norway. And he learned subsequently that the Nazis had broken into her, or came into her home and stole all her blankets. So she froze to death.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's a terrible story.
Yeah, isn't it? So, and yet Chris was so much a part of the town. he had his own automobile business, and the same family had the camera store right on Walton Street for years. Many of these families contributed in ways that I just had no idea.
Sure.
And that was particularly true of just one more, and that is Jeremiah Sheehan. And Jeremiah came from Ireland, not exactly sure when, but that's on the tape, I believe. And he became a very successful farmer in West Concord, where the Concord Green is. He owned all that land, which then ultimately went to the Comoes, and then to all these condos. So Jeremiah, and there was a Catholic church, Our Ladies, in West Concord. And then right across the street was the West Concord Union Church. And the West Concord Union Church would have a dinner sometimes, in which everybody would come and pay as a way of supporting the church, or just general needs for income. And Jeremiah, Mr. Sheehan, over and over donated so many vegetables from his garden. And he became friends with Mr. Campbell, who was the first minister of West Concord Union Church. So once again, totally unexpected. Then the two generations later, I had the opportunity to interview about 4 or 5 together, his grandchildren and their spouses, in the living room. I still remember being asked if I would like a highball. Heard that term for a long time. So, but then again, the surprise was to learn that 2 of their younger generation had died, had been killed in the Vietnam War. So there was an incredible sadness about it. Okay?
Thank you. Those are really moving stories. Thank you for sharing those. You said that your students at Concord Academy did not participate in, conducting these interviews, but you did share that you found other ways to share what you learned through those interviews. Would you say that, it's something that you shared with your students in the classroom, and it's something you discussed with them about Concord?
Concord Academy has a tradition going way, way, way back, in which students who are seniors are encouraged to give a 15-minute talk in the morning. And also faculty were asked to do the same. So twice I chose, or I was asked to give a chapel talk, as we call it, at something like 8:15 in the morning. And I used both to talk about Concord and its history from the vantage point of this immigrant experience, rather than just simply talking about the Minutemen, as exciting as they were. I must say also that when I first thought that I'd like to do some writing, I thought, oh my goodness, I can't write about the Minutemen. I can't write about the Revolution. I can't write about Thoreau, because there are all these experts who know far, far more than I do, and can be extraordinarily articulate, like Bob Gross. So this sort of fell into my lap about immigrants. And I'd grown up in a city of Northampton that was very much a second generation town, most especially um, a large Polish population. I think there were more kids whose grandparents came, or sometimes parents, from Poland in the high school class than any other country by far. Um, so I'd always had that interest of immigrants and their backgrounds.
Renee's book, Concord in the Days of Strawberries and Streetcars, was published in 1985 and incorporated many stories she'd gathered in her interviews. You contributed a chapter in that book on the immigrant experience in Concord. How did that come about? And I assume you based a good portion of your chapter on your interviews, but you also conducted a lot of other research.
And I think that first, that when the book was published in 1985, it was to mark the 350th anniversary of the town and its founding. So, of course, the town was very eager to celebrate in many, many ways. And so an obvious one was to write a history, which is what Renee did. And she chose the title Strawberries and Streetcars, I think, as a way of looking back to perhaps a more innocent era in which farming played a much greater role. For example, most of the Norwegian men who came from Leuten worked for farmers. They were farm laborers until they were able to establish themselves. And the Norwegian women were maidservants right along the line of all those houses on Main Street. So I was given the position of being in charge of the publishing of the book because of my membership of the Historical Commission. So it was my job to find a publisher, a designer for the book, because this was the sort of thing that Renee and I knew nothing about. And they did a marvelous job, absolutely marvelous. Now, how it came to be with the immigrant experience, I think I probably asked Renee if I could do that. And she was very encouraging for me to do that. And that involved, as you said earlier, not just simply interviews. I did a lot of research. The two greatest sources of information for me were the newspapers, the Concord Journal, and maybe another Concord newspaper, but especially the census, of which the library had copies online, whatever the equivalent was then. And so I would look at, say, the census of 1910, and I was able to compile all the origins of these countries and how many of them were there. And I believe in 1910, at least 35, maybe more % of the population were either immigrants or children of immigrants. Again, something I had not perceived in the beginning, and certainly I think the people in Concord did not perceive of that either. So the census, I still have printed up pages and pages and pages of the census that are in the trunk of my car, waiting for me to see if I'm going to do anything more with them. In any case, then once the book was published, Father Rogers at St. Bernard's, Holy Family, I guess is now called, got in touch with me and asked me if I would write a history of St. Bernard's. And I remember being very modest because I thought, and I did say to Father Rogers, I am not a Catholic. And, well, I see an advantage in that. That you will have some perspective that members of my congregation simply don't have. I have tried before with members, and they get so carried away with their stories that there's just simply not a factual basis. Then sometime later, Gene Curtis, who was the pastor at West Concord Union Church, asked me if I would write a history to mark, I believe, the 100th anniversary of the West Concord Union Church. So I did more interviews.
Yeah.
Those are still, I think, in the archives of the church. And I had a wonderful committee this time. What am I saying? With St. Bernard's, the chair of the committee was a woman named Anna Goulding Mannion. It was the first woman, I believe, to be elected select person in the town. And her forebears, her grandparents, maybe even her parents, all came from Ireland. She was magnificent. It was she who would organize all the meetings for the research, not me. She did that. And I just looked into all these elements for research and did the writing. And also at the West Concord Union Church, there were a group of maybe 6 or 7 members of the church that were part of the committee. And at that point, I think I had become more sophisticated in how to go about all of this kind of thing. So I would ask them each to volunteer. So Win Hindle, who was, I think, either the president or the vice president of digital, he would agree to look at 10 years of the Concord Journal. And because in those days, the journal had extensive reporting on what was going on in those churches. Extensive, very newsy. And others did the same. I would just divide up their labors and reap the benefits.
Yeah, that sounds very smart. That sounds great. To get lots involved and get lots of their time and energy to help you. So
yeah, it was a great experience.
In a recent tribute at Concord Academy, one of your former students said that you made an indelible impression on him in the life of your students because you wanted your students to know they could make a difference. You encouraged your students to learn from the past, to view the present with open minds and welcoming hearts, and to recognize the extraordinary details, viewpoints, and people in the world around them. How do you think the experiences and viewpoints of immigrants to Concord contributes to our understanding of the town's history? And what should we have learned from hearing their stories and viewpoints?
As a teacher at Concord Academy, I wasn't so eager to share the immigrant experience as I was to introduce, and that is the right word because it wasn't done before, introduce the concept of experiential learning. So here we were, these students living in this incredibly historic town, whether it be the Revolution or the Concord authors. And at the same time, I became very interested in the city of Lowell. And I taught a course comparing Lowell with its experience, which was far more in depth in terms of an immigrant experience, as well as industrialization. So what I would do is get buses,
Mhm.
take the students to Lowell,
Mhm. Mhm.
take the students out to Walden Pond.
Mm.
There is a sort of place, I'm not sure it even exists anymore at Walden, where there's an open space
Mhm.
facing the pond
Mhm.
with seating made up of just simply sap trees.
Mhm. Mhm.
And one time I encouraged my students to come with me.
Mhm.
And we talked about Thoreau and Walden
Mhm.
right there.
Mm.
Um, so, and then I did a lot of that when I taught at the Little Red Schoolhouse in
Mhm.
New York City,
Mhm.
where once again, the opportunities,
Mhm.
how could you not,
Mm.
of New York,
Mhm.
um, leave the classroom? So I proposed, and the school loved the idea
Mhm.
of taking the entire sophomore class
Mhm.
um, each year to Concord.
Mm.
And we stayed at the inn right next to
Yeah.
Paparazzi's. And we went to Lowell,
Mhm.
and we went to Walden Pond, and we
Mhm.
went to uh, Sleepy Hollow Cemetery.
Mhm.
And of course, we went to the battle site.
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Wow, those are really rich experiences you shared with the students. So,
and the other thing that I
yeah.
did
Mhm.
that was sort of amazing in retrospect is in terms of experiential learning at
Mhm.
Concord was to visit the Concord prison.
Mm.
Uh, and we were fortunate enough to have a deputy superintendent
Mhm.
who was all for the idea of my students in my law class
Mhm.
taking a
Mhm.
tour of the
Mhm.
prison,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and then meeting with a small group of inmates
Mhm.
who, through sharing their experiences, had been told or been encouraged to do that as a way of not just as a catharsis, but
Mhm.
a way of coming to grips with what they had done.
Mhm.
Um, and so, unlike other experiences I had in which inmates would put all the blame on
Mhm.
the police and were innocent,
Mhm.
these men were not.
Mhm.
Um, and to this day,
Mm.
some of my students talk about that experience back in the
Mhm.
early 1980s
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
as in some ways staggering.
Thank you again, Bill, for joining us today. And we've really all enjoyed our time with you. And
My
we
pleasure, Anka. My pleasure. All
thank
right.
you.
Thank you.
Um, and thank you again for joining us today for another installment of Concord Stories. And thank you to the Concord Free Public Library and the Concord Free Public Library Corporation for sponsoring this series. I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you.
Very welcome. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye, Bill.